The harm principle at the macro level is that the state has the legitimate obligation to restrict conduct when consequences are not isolated to that individual, but also spills over and structurally damage the society. I'm not quite sure why this hasn't been vetoed by Gov. I don't know if you guys really debated that long, because all of their cases are not just stuck cases, but also remains divorced out of reality. I have a lot of responses because this debate tends to imagine a lot of unicorns, which are, by the way, a lot of shit that's happening within the debate that's not even true. By the way, opposition's burden is just the status quo, which is again, in the status quo, some drugs are legal in some state and some are not. That's why the cap plays the word all to point out the comparative for all state, etc. That's why you guys have the hard burden, as Calvin pointed out. We have few prongs in opposition that remains unresponded by Gov, and I'm going to wait as I discuss further with these issues. I have a lot. Number one, hard drugs destroy the capacity for responsible consumption itself because Gov pretended that regulation can succeed. And this is where I want to flip their entire claim of agency and recreational freedom, because we point out that drug use stops being purely private choice once the substance substantially impairs a person's capacity to consistently act as a rational and socially responsible agent. The reason is that this is different from alcohol and cigarette. It's not just because of the degree of harm, but the fact that many hard drugs create far stronger compulsive tendency and cognitive impairment, i.e., the user loses meaningful control over future choices much faster and more severely because of the chemicals behind it. That's why a lot of people commit crime faster when they are high in comparison to when they are stoned with Marlboro Reds, for example. I'm debating while I am also doing this stuff anyways. Sure, you legalize shabu, but the world that you create is structurally anti-poor because poor communities are the least capable of absorbing the consequences of addiction. Wealthier individuals will still have access to therapy, rehab, stable families, and financial cushions, but poorer communities are far more exposed to the cycles of dependency. And by the way, they will still commit crime, but it just amplifies the psychological recklessness of these individuals because again, they cannot rationalize well and you open more doors for them. I'm not quite sure why you have proven why, the state will suddenly create all of this stuff, the state will suddenly create all of this good rehab, when right now, even if we treat them as something that is much more important to solve because it shouldn't be legalized in the first place, the rehab system is still bad. So I'm not quite sure why it's suddenly going to improve in your case. So their benefit is framed as a compassion for the poor, but that people in desperate condition should have a way to cope. But that is exactly the problem. You do not solve poverty by making addiction more accessible to the most to the people most vulnerable to it. You're giving them you're not giving them relief. You are giving them the state permission to normalize their deterioration instead of addressing the condition that made them desperate in the first place. It's a false solution. A lot of poor individuals can jump into this, and you make their conditions far worse when they can find a job because they're so reliant with drugs in the first place that you normalize. Number two, the entry point to harm is structurally different. Since Gov are so deluded to compare Marlboro Reds Emperador Lights to a literal possible usage of anthrax, let's be clear with the distinction, which washes out the attempt of Gov to reduce this debate into a mere question of stigma rather than addressing the material distinct risk posed by these substances in the first place. The distinction is not just simply like hard drugs have higher ceiling of harm than alcohol or cigarettes. The deeper difference is that the margin of the casual use and the serious dependency is dramatically smaller from the beginning because the substances alter reward and impulse system chemically, aggressively, even at early stages of consumption. That's why society can realistically sustain millions of functional smokers or social drinkers, whereas widespread use of meth, fentanyl, or crack predictably produces far higher rate of instability, compulsive behavior, and social breakdown even without long consumption history. So we point out that once a substance predictably destroys the very autonomy needed to contain its effect privately, the consequences inevitably spill outward into the society. This doesn't just harm the poor, this harms other people who doesn't use this in the first place because you normalize the usage of it. There will be more enticed to use this in their parties, etc. And I want to point out, it is harder to regulate in their side because regulation assumes that people can still respond rationally to limits, warnings, pricing, and dosage rules. Like for example, they point out that, you will have in the status quo, you have age limit, but even with cigarette, vapes, and alcohol, minors still access them because normalization makes them look socially acceptable or cool. There's a lot of ways for them to pivot this, and the market that you open literally makes it more accessible for them because you can just see them in other markets, for example, or in other stores, for example. That problem becomes far worse with hard drug use because once user enters consumption consumption, the substance itself rapidly weakens impulse control, judgment, and the capacity to obey the safeguards they meant to regulate the use in the first place. So I'm not quite sure how do they simply regulate this. So I'm not quite sure I'm not quite sure with the MEC. So on our side, non-users are currently deterred by a combination of legal risk, social stigma, fear of addiction, and restricted access, which prevents many people from experimenting with hard drugs in the first place, which is an exclusive benefit in our side. And also, existing users, meanwhile, are recognized by illegality because access is more unstable, consumption is less socially normalized, and there remains the external pressures from other social factions. Just shut up. Let me finish this. And institutions to stop or seek rehabilitation. Government weakens both the barriers simultaneously. They lower the psychological threshold for non-users to try drugs, while also reducing the social institutional pressure on assisting users to exit this dependency in the first place. POI.
So let's talk realisticness, regulation, since that's a talked up once. If you will still, to some extent, have some regulation on your side, and your response is that regulation will not work on government, that is a self-defeating response over your side of the house.
You don't. You know why regulations exist in the status quo and why it's easier for us to regulate them? Because we regulate the drugs that can be regulated in the first place. In your side, it's hard for you to regulate anthrax because anthrax literally has a lot of threshold and has a lot of different burden in your chemical bounds of your brain. So literally, that POI doesn't make any sense. Number three, legalization does not retroactively erase criminal liability, and I want to set this clear. Just because drugs are now legal, this does not automatically extinguish criminal liability for acts committed while the conduct was still prohibited by law. That's why their PM is kind of out of the debate. Just like, what kind of weighing is that? That doesn't even exist in the status quo within the legal system. Like, as a general principle in crim law, penal statutes operate prospectively unless the legislature explicitly provide for the retroactive relief of it. So even if you like legalize it, I'm not quite sure why you're going to previous penal statutes or previous penal violators. So, and number 4, they said that if you cannot regulate something, just legalize it. There are a lot of pedophiles within the status quo. Do we really make a regulated market for child exploitation because we can not regulate it? I don't think that the state conduct should be that way. Rehab in our side is a lot stronger because society still recognizes drug addiction as a harm that must be corrected, not a lifestyle that must be normalized, and state have the police authority to at least ambitiously try to eliminate all of the harm and prevent casual experimentation of this, because that is the burden of the state. The state is not just your I don't know. Yeah, we are not regulated, so therefore we shouldn't do this in the first place. I think the purpose of the state is to regulate every persistent evil merely because offenders continue to exist.